One of the greatest perks of my job is that I get to not just meet, but occasionally even be in conversation with authors whose work I admire, such as Ann Packer. She's the author of 2 collections of short stories and 2 previous novels. She was awarded a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, and she's won numerous awards. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker and in the O. Henry Stories Prize anthologies. Her debut novel, The Dive from Clausen's Pier, earned critical acclaim, and it was also a bestseller. It's a book I find myself thinking about often, as much for its haunting premise as its rich detail. It begins with the premise of a young woman already ambivalent about marrying her fiancé, who's faced with a moral dilemma about what to do after he becomes a quadriplegic in a diving accident. It's a book that in lesser hands, as the New York Times noted, could have congealed into a daytime television mess of syrupy sentiment, and that it never threatens to is a mark of Packer's ample talents. Her new novel, The Childrens Crusade, is similarly imbued with similar moral questions and the same rich texture and haunting details. But in many ways, it's a much more ambitious novel. It's the story of one upper-middle-class California family told from multiple points of view and spanning some 60 or so years. So before we get started, let's pause for a moment to formally welcome Ann Packer. So, Ann, do you want to begin with the reading, or?
Yeah, I think what I'll do, since the book's only...
If you'd like to go to the... If you prefer to go to the podium, you can do that.
I do, because I don't know how to hold the book and the microphone. Great. Thanks so much for coming out on a slightly rainy evening, and I'm really happy to be back at this wonderful bookstore. Came by for my last book, I think, about 4 years ago, and it's always been a favorite. So thank you, Susan, for the nice welcome. I'm going to just read from the beginning of the book, and since it's the beginning, I don't need to tell you anything about it. It'll just be about 5 minutes. Bill Blair received his discharge from the Navy on a September morning in 1954. He'd served on hospital ships off Incheon and Pusan, Korea, for 2 years, and then completed his service at the Oak Knoll Naval Hospital, a cluster of wooden barracks on a grassy hillside in Oakland, California. On the afternoon of his discharge, he borrowed a convertible and headed across the Bay Bridge, an unplanned adventure that seemed like just the ticket for a fellow with some time on his hands. The sky was the same lovely shade of blue as the hyacinths in the bridal bouquet at his sister's wedding 4 months earlier. He'd gotten a weekend's leave and made it home to Michigan in time for a pre-wedding family breakfast at which his years of service were so celebrated that the very thing he'd sought from the trip, a return to the life he'd known before open wounds and gangrenous limbs and amputations, slipped finally and irrevocably out of his grasp. Outside the church, he stood with his parents in his dress blues and felt as lonely as he ever had in his life. He'd first seen San Francisco from the deck of the USS Haven, under a sky choked with clouds. Now, as he drove, he found himself drawn less to the bright downtown than to the low-lying hills beyond it, beribboned with candy-colored houses. He stayed on the highway, heading for the next set of hills, and soon he was moving alongside the pale bay, approaching the airport. Seagulls swooped out of the sky, tiny icons of the aircraft landing on the glittering tarmac. This was the first convertible he'd ever driven, and despite all his time at sea, he'd never had quite such a confrontation with the wind. His face was pummeled, his hair blown flatter than the bunk of an enlisted man. Up ahead, on the prow of the car, the noble, brave Pontiac bore down on the unknown with an attitude of calm determination. Leaving the bay shore, Bill meandered for a mile or two until he found the King's Highway, or so it would be called if the name were rendered in English. This he knew from the bits of Spanish he'd picked up in Oakland. El Camino Real, This King's Highway boasted car lots and supermarkets. Nothing to fill Bill's heart. But every so often a vista opened and included the sudden rise of yet more hills, some thickly forested, others the color of hay bales in autumn. He pointed the chrome Indian westward and drove through neighborhoods of brand new houses that seemed like decoys for something marvelous he would discover soon. Twisting past a golf course, he entered a grove of pines. Narrow roads split off and disappeared around curves and up hills. On an impulse, he followed one of these, winding among low-hanging branches with leaves like tiny silver spears. When he slowed down, a smell of earth and bark came to him, and overlaying that, something pleasantly medicinal, the inside of a pharmacy staffed by wood creatures. The road leveled off, and a path beckoned him to leave the car and make his way to a clearing where a magnificent oak tree stood guard. He was the grandson of a farmer on his mother's side and a doctor on his father's, both third-generation Michiganders. As a boy, he'd expected a life like that of his father, the doctor's son, who'd gone to work at a local bank and was now president and chairman of the board, a man who dressed in a suit and tie every day and had the house painted biannually because it was important to keep up appearances. Bill's mother was an exemplary housekeeper, using vinegar to make the windows sparkle and bleach to keep the bedsheets bright on the line. Known locally as the gal whose one visit to Chicago had left her half blind after a small rock kicked up by a streetcar struck her in the eye, she had a glass eyeball with a blue iris 2 or 3 shades lighter than her true eye color, an asymmetry that made her shy with strangers and unassailable to her children. Bill had grown up believing virtue was a ticket to contentment, but the war had exploded that notion, and he needed something to replace it. The oak was the most splendid tree he'd ever seen, its gnarled branches snaking every which way. He would learn later that it was a California live oak, species Quercus agrifolia, or sharp-leaved oak, and the ground beneath it was carpeted with curled, brittle leaves and peculiar elongated acorns. An idea had been forming during his last months of service that his skills and training could be adapted toward a type of medicine that might, over time, supplant his memories of men blown open with bodies that wouldn't be subjected to such violence, the bodies of children. He would have to do a second residency in pediatrics, but he did not mind the idea of deferring his work life for a few more years. A period of preparation more or less equal to the number of months he'd given the Navy might in some way cancel that experience and return him to the confidence and optimism he'd felt on the day he received his sheepskin from the University of Michigan Medical School, the best he could hope for now that his family had mistaken him for a hero. He surveyed the land in front of him and slipped into a reverie in which he was surrounded by children, dozens of them, darting between trees, throwing balls, jumping in leaf piles, calling "Ollie, Ollie, oxen free," more children than he could father himself, but not nearly as many as he could help. I'll stop there. So Penny is a woman who is of her age. She's a young wife and mother in the 60s, and she's just not cut out for it. She's kind of okay with the first 3 children, whose names maybe we should fill you in are Robert, Rebecca, and Ryan. And then there's James, who comes along a little bit after the rest of them and is a wild man. And he is her undoing. And as a result, of course, she is his. And so one of the things that I wanted to look at in the book was the way a badly paired mother and child would affect each other and would affect the rest of the family. She pulls away, and I don't want to give a lot away. We'll try to dance around any major plot points, but she does pull away in order to try to become an artist, but also just to pull away and to absent herself. And it's interesting that you say that I'm neutral. I feel like that's a great compliment, because when I first started writing the book, she was a monster. And it took me 4 years to kind of tone her down and give her more depth, and to try to find my way toward a more neutral position. So thanks.
And there's a question about the cause and effect of that with James. I mean, did you see her as pulling away? You give us an almost Sophie's choice of a premise, in a sense that she wanted 3 children. She named them all with names that began with letter R, and then came James. So as you set it up, was it really because of the 4th child that she...
Well, I actually feel that that's really the reader's task, is to experience the book for herself or himself. And if that kind of question is an important question for a particular reader, then I think they're going to want to arrive at their own conclusion. I think, stepping aside from that idea and more into a philosophy, I think everything is an interaction. So I wouldn't in life want to say anything was one person's doing or another person's doing.
Well, in that vein, the New York Times review called you the connoisseur of the selfish act, and I wonder what you think about that. I assume that was referring to the mother's character, but you could.
Well, I think that the reviewer was reaching back to the die from Clausen's Pier and the young woman who ditches her paralyzed fiance, and to me, that phrase, the connoisseur, I mean, I'll wear it. I'm going to have T-shirts made up or something, but I like it. I don't think that Penny is committing a selfish act, and to me, that was more a reviewer having fun putting some words together.
Also, I noticed some of the reviews have referred to this as an unhappy family, and it was not entirely an unhappy family, I would say, in reading it. What do you think of that?
I was very surprised by that in the New York Times and elsewhere, there's sort of like they're all in various degrees of unhappiness. And first of all, it made me wonder, like, how are we living in this country? Is everyone so doing so well that these very normal people who are, having ordinary life struggles are they seem unhappy? There's not a story unless there's a problem. And problems cause people to feel pressure, and under pressure, moods change and behavior is not always pretty. So for me, it's hard to know how you could write a novel about characters in conflict with themselves and each other, and not sort of enter into certainly complex mental states, if not outright unhappiness. But I do think that some of the siblings, the book is structured in 10 sections, and 4 of them take place in the present day, with the 4 siblings each narrating part of the story. And then the rest are told by an omniscient narrator and dip in and out of important moments in the family's history. And I totally just lost my train of thought.
Well, how did you arrive at that structure? That's such a complicated task you've set yourself with.
Oh, I know what I was going to say, if we can just go back. Sorry. The 4 children, at least one of them, I think, is actually a very happy person.
Ryan.
Yeah. So moving to the structure then, it was really expedience, in that as I was trying to begin the book, and I'm talking about a period of many, many months, I was writing from different points of view. I would try Robert's voice. I would try James's voice. I tried a little bit in the third person. And, I didn't want to waste any of that. So I came up with a structure that would enable me to build each of those beginnings into a section that would take part in what's actually a kind of a braided structure.
And where did the origins of this story begin? Did you just begin with an oak tree, or?
Did not begin with the oak tree at all. Interestingly, this goes back about 10 years. And I was finishing my last novel and thinking about a brother and a sister. And the sister was older and somewhat protective, and the brother was in trouble. And he came home, and he and the sister had some conflict around an affair he was having with the married woman. And I wrote 50 pages of that, and it just was not going anywhere. I couldn't get it off the ground, and I abandoned it. Wrote a whole other book. And then, like I said before, I don't want to waste anything. I was looking at it after I turned in my last book, which was a collection of stories, and I started thinking about a larger family group and something that wasn't just a brother and a sister. I grew up in a family of one girl and one boy. I have one brother. And I think unconsciously I wanted to push past that and write about a large family. And so I when I picked the material back up, I still had the sister and the younger brother in trouble, but I added 2 more brothers. And the sister was not quite the same woman, and the brother was not quite the same man, but that situation, that little germ, did move into what actually became the Childrens Crusade.
And how long did it take you to write this?
This book took me about 4 years.
And it seems California, Northern California, is as much of a subject here as any of the characters. You wanna?
The setting, I think it's probably the most I've done with setting in any of my novels. I mean, Madison is important in the Dive from Clausen's Pier, and the Bay Area is somewhat important in Songs Without Words, but the landscape really informed the writing of this book, and that sort of starts with my remembering this community of Portola Valley, which is where the book is set, from my childhood. And I grew up in a very tidy, sort of suburban, groomed area. But just over the hill was Portola Valley, which was much more rustic. And there were sort of fields and tons of old oak trees. And our family went to visit friends there. And my memory, very vague but intense, is of these kids of this family we were visiting just kind of running free on their property. And something about that image helped me to take the idea of 4 children and start creating actual characters. And so the landscape was always part of the story for that reason.
And you describe so nicely the transformation of this area. When Bill first sees this land, there's nothing there but an oak tree. And by the time the book closes, a very wealthy CEO of Silicon Valley money has invaded the area.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it was very easy for me to describe that. Things have changed a lot.
Well, one of the things I love about your work is just how the small details really stick with me. And in this book, one of the sort of smaller elements is the family that's moved into this house, the very wealthy family of the CEO. And one of the daughters is very troubled. Do you want to talk about her a little bit?
Yeah, so the present story that's narrated by each of the 4 grown Blair children concerns what happens when James, the black sheep, the problem child, the ne'er-do-well, comes home in trouble, and it emerges that he's interested in selling the family home. The father has died, the mother is gone, I won't say how or where, and he wants money. And so they have to deal with the fact that there are tenants in the house, and this family, they're called the Vincents, have rented the house with the hope that eventually the Blair children would sell it to them so that they could tear it down and build a mansion. And so part of the conflict for the four siblings is what's going to happen if this does happen, if this sale does go through. And the kind of conflict around that fuels much of the present day story.
And the daughter with her.
And the daughter, right.
Yeah.
So that family has two children, and the younger daughter is, as you say, troubled. And the parents, so the four siblings, Robert is a doctor, Rebecca's a psychiatrist, Ryan's a school teacher, and then James, everybody together, is a ne'er-do-well. And so the parents of that family want to consult Rebecca, the psychiatrist. She's actually a child psychiatrist, about their daughter. And she, very politely tells them that she doesn't take on people she knows socially. And it's sort of a mark of their entitlement or whatever, that they won't take no for an answer. So the little girl and her issues become kind of a challenge for each of the four Blair siblings to place into the puzzle of what the future is going to hold for this house, and what effect will it have on this troubled little girl if they stay or if they don't stay.
Yeah, that's nicely done. I urge you to read the book, and I really was very affected by the little girl's story. Can you talk about the title a little bit?
Sure. So early in the book, the children are aware that their mother is, not 100% there, and they decide to go on a crusade to bring her back into the heart of the family. And they want to come up with ideas that will encourage her to participate in family outings or whatever it might be. And it's a fairly self-contained part of the book, this idea, this crusade. And, as do most projects of children, it gets abandoned. But the word crusade and the idea of a children's crusade actually gets transformed by the end of the novel. And it's not giving anything away, I don't think, to say that by the end of the book, the Children's Crusade is essentially a phrase that attempts to describe what Bill, the father, most deeply believes, which is that children deserve care. So it becomes a crusade on behalf of children instead of by children.
And there's a lot about nature versus nurture in this book. I wonder, even thinking about yourself, you're from a family of academics. Was there ever any thought in your mind of doing anything other than writing?
There wasn't a thought of doing anything other than writing, but there also wasn't a thought of doing writing. So for a long time when I was growing up, my mother's a writer. My brother always wanted to be a writer, and I wasn't at all interested. It's what I wasn't going to do. And in fact, looking at her and her career, she also taught writing. She had many friends who were writers. They all looked so miserable that I just thought, what's the fun in that? And it wasn't until I went to college and a friend talked me into applying for a fiction writing class that I thought, well, okay, fine. Actually, I really fought my friend. He said, come on, we'll both do it. we'll apply to this writing class. We'll go and we'll have fun. We're seniors. Let's do it. I said, okay, fine. I got in. He didn't. And within 3 weeks, I had like essentially a conversion experience. Sort of like, wow, if this counts as work, I'll do it.
It's not misery then.
It's really not. And sometimes I feel guilty talking to other writers who often, maybe you've had this experience either yourself or with talking to others, emphasize the hard parts and the unknown and the days when you don't know what you're doing over the other kinds of days.
Well, I'll ask you a few questions about your own writing habits, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. So are you someone who sets out knowing what you're going to do when you start a new project?
No, I'm really the opposite of that. I don't remember who it is, Richard Ford maybe. Somebody describes the process of writing fiction as you're driving on a highway.
Doctorow.
Is it Doctorow? Okay. You're driving on a highway at night and all you can see is as far as what your headlights illuminate. And you're just constantly moving into the light, which actually means that you're moving into the darkness, searching for what it is that you want to write. And I'm very much that kind of writer. I don't plan at all. I can't plan at all. And with this book in particular, I really had no idea what I was doing, and often would, enter a paragraph with no sense of how it was going to end and where the characters would be 7 lines down the page, which was a little nerve-wracking, but kind of fun.
And are you very disciplined? Do you write at the same time every day? Or?
No. I wouldn't say I'm undisciplined, but I'm very loose about it. I write just when I can. And I haven't had any problems with that approach. Although I always sort of think, especially at the beginning of a book, that, it's really, really hard at the beginning of a book. And it might be that I will have to kind of get myself into a routine just in order to, sit in the chair and stay there for as long as I can bear.
Do you have another book in the works yet?
So I read an interview with David Gates once where someone asked him that question. And he said, "Same to you, buddy."
Oh, sorry. Okay. I did not mean it
So
that
the
in an
answer is-
antagonistic way.
No, of course you didn't. The answer is I don't. I've never published a book without having the next one underway before, and it's very uncomfortable.
Sorry, wrong question.
No.
Let's turn it over to you
Not at
now.
all.
Does anybody have any questions? There we go.
Hi, thank you for reading and for your book. The dive from Clausen's Pier, we were talking about a selfish act earlier. Do you consider the choice that she made a selfish act?
No. I consider it a life-saving act.
Right.
I consider it a difficult, provocative, necessary, hurtful, but not selfish.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because when I read that book, it was a long time ago when it first came out. It's just she's in such a place where she, for her own, I guess, survival, she has to make this choice. But I could really identify with where she was, and here she was just about ready to break it off anyway, and then this thing intervenes, and then you have all these people you assume these people are judging you, and how loyal are you, and all that sort of stuff. So it was the book stays with me after all that time. So.
Well, it was really a litmus test for people, I think. I mean, the opinions of readers were powerful in one direction or the other. And, it was probably a pretty even split between people who thought she was a horrible person and people who thought that the people who thought she was a horrible person were horrible.
Right. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the dynamic between you and your mother. You said she's a writer, and you come from a family of writers, so for you to kind of go to it in this very easy way, do you think that it was different from how everybody else in your family approached it, or?
By easy way, do you mean that when I first started doing it, I enjoyed it so much?
Yes. Or that you kind of didn't have this preconceived notion of yourself as a writer. You sort of found it before you thought about yourself being a writer, in a way.
Well, I don't know that my mother had a preconceived notion of herself as a writer. She may have had a sort of similar doing it and then thinking about it kind of experience. My brother definitely thought about it a lot before he did it. And he'll be the first to tell you that he wanted to write fiction and eventually discovered that he was just a lot more comfortable with journalism and nonfiction.
Interesting.
And I don't know if that has anything to do with the question or the sort of self-consciousness, like to have self-consciousness about becoming a writer. Fiction might be harder to enter from that perspective. I'm just guessing, but yeah. So, thanks.
Do I have to go over there? So I'm only about 113 pages into the book. But what really strikes me is the way you write in the children's dialogue. I read the children's dialogue and I'm like, first of all, you don't condescend to the children at all. And so you buy into how they talk to one another. I think you have a really good ear for how they talk. And I wondered if you had, do you have children? So you have?
I do. I have 2 children.
Yeah, but I'm assuming they're grown up. So are you listening to children still? Because I don't, like reading it, I go, oh yeah, that's how they would talk to one another. But there's a lot of it, at least in the section I read, and I found it very true. And I thought, wow, are you spending time with little kids, or were you just really enchanted with them, and you managed to enter in sort of their world very effectively? And I just wondered where that came from.
I don't think it certainly has to do with observing children, but I think it also has to do with remembering and calling on, 40, 50-year memories of what it feels like to be a child. I think, you create the character from the inside out, and the dialogue both comes out of what you've already created and defines the thing that you're creating. So it's a very important part of characterization for me. Elizabeth Bowen said, dialogue is what characters do to each other. I always like that. Hi.
You talked about writing and not necessarily knowing where you'll be at the end of a paragraph, at the end of a page. At what point writing this novel or other novels did you have a better sense, or did you ever, of this is where I want to end up, and I'll know when I'm done when I get there?
That comes late and slowly, for the most part. It's also interesting for me to contemplate that part of writing, and I think that I've given myself some kind of amnesia about certain parts of the process, and I can't actually remember when I knew how it was going to end. This book in particular, I sold it on the basis of 350 pages, and I had to write an outline for the rest of it. And I, as I've said, I don't outline, I don't plan. And so I just sat down and wrote something. And I figured it doesn't matter because I can write whatever I want later. This is just something to give them a sense of what my ideas might be. And I ended up writing the book exactly that way. So I made a decision on the spot, and that actually guided me for the last 150 pages. Obviously I had to fill it in, but I sort of think about that as a kind of a challenge to my belief about myself that I don't plan. And I don't plan consciously, but somehow or other there was a conduit.
Mm-hmm. So, on the other side of as you begin a book, reading The Dive from Clausen's Pier was an amazing experience for me. Do you begin with the idea of a moral dilemma and work from that, or do you think about the characters first, or what's the nucleus? Or it probably is different for different books, but
Well, with The Dive from Clausen's Pier, I began with a girl in this situation, and I built her as I built the situation, but the germ was those two things together. There was no character without the dilemma, and there was no dilemma without the character. This book, I didn't know what was at stake. And because it spans such a long period of time, there isn't a single moral dilemma. I mean, maybe the great dilemma of the book, is there a great dilemma of the book, would have to be something like, how do we manage, or something like that, something pretty broad. But as I populate the book, as I build the characters, as I give them dialogue, conflict inevitably comes in. And any two characters in conflict with each other are probably going to have a moral dilemma. So they just kind of sprout.
thank you.
Thanks.
It's a pretty basic question, so I'll ask two.
Why not?
First, how do you know when you're done? Do you beat yourself up about that? Do they have to drag it away from you? And the second question, I'll just get it out of the way. Do you know right away when you've written something that really sings? Do you get to the end of some days and think, God, I just hit that out of the park? Or does that vary?
I'll answer the second one first. There are days that feel great. But to ask, how do I know if it sings? Actually, all I know is that it sings to me. And so I can't ever really know what's going to sing to other people, which is why my process of being in a writer's group and having my friends and co-members give me feedback is so important. And in terms of being finished or knowing that I'm finished, it's just a feeling. I mean, I revise a lot. I probably did 5 separate drafts of this book. Each time I'm sort of focusing in closer and closer on making certain things different. And there just comes a time where I've kind of had a list of things to work on, and I've gone through it, and I'm feeling better and better about it, and the feedback is getting more and more consistent. And then I get to that point. It helps to have, the book scheduled. It's like, okay, if you really want to be published in April, we're going to have to get that manuscript. Any other questions?
I'll ask you one last
Okay.
Clausen's Pier question. Was it surprising to hear from so many readers that had such strong opinions about the book?
It was shocking, utterly shocking. My first intimation that it might have that kind of effect happened just before the book came out. There was a booksellers' dinner, and it was in San Francisco, and there were a lot of booksellers from independents all around the area. And I walked in, and 3 women like rushed up to me and said, "How could you end it that way?" And I was stunned. It never occurred to me that it could end any other way or that anyone would care. So it really was, very, very surprising. And I'm, looking forward to finding out if there's anything divisive in this book. So,
Well, thank you so much. We have books behind the register, and Anne's going to be signing right here. So thank you.
thank you. Thanks, everyone.